We will now hear from Deborah Golden, Deloitte's Federal Cyber Risk Services Leader, about changes the federal government is making to become more innovative and adaptable when it comes to cybersecurity.
Hi.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. I also want to thank Deloitte again for underwriting the webcast that we have today.
It's our pleasure.
It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
So when we talked, you told me that there's this synergy happening between the federal government and industry, and that the federal government is trying to look a little bit more like industry in a few different ways. Can you expand on that a bit?
Sure, happy to do so. You know, I think one of the things, and I think one of the speakers before mentioned the ecosystem and the fact that our ecosystems are growing. And so it's no longer just the organization or the agency thinking about what's in their four walls. It's everything from the internet things to mobile devices to medical devices to interconnected cities. You know, we're really starting to see an expansion of the ecosystem. And with that expansion of ecosystem, we start to get into not only single agency, but cross agency, and then lo and behold, into actually private sector as well because of the synergies between these agencies and what's going on. And so when you look at perhaps someone, say in federal health, they would be advantageous to reach out to individuals in the private sector, either providers or plans or life sciences, because of the information and or the connectedness that they may have to one another. And so what we're starting to see is more and more agencies wanting to have that synergy and that open dialogue. Again, there was some conversation in the prior panel around not only policy and compliance needs for that, but also just the ability to share information and how it will help the consumer ultimately, whether that be a federal consumer or a private agency consumer. The need and the desire to be interconnected and sharing is just growing. And in order to do that, that's why we're seeing kind of the federal agencies reaching out more and vice versa. There's a number of private organizations that really want to understand what federal agencies are doing, and whether that's from a compliance perspective, whether that's because they're writing the policy and they want to be more and more like those policies integrated into their own environments. We are really starting to see the collaboration needed going up between both privacy and federal, and then the other way as well.
Great. Can you talk about the other way a little bit? I know there have been some swaps in the government and private sector so that they can learn on both sides.
Right.
What do you see as some of the benefits of that moving forward?
I mean, there's a ton of benefits, both from just an education perspective, having spent a number of years myself in commercial and then coming into the federal government. There's a lot that could be learned both ways, being able to share commercial best practices and what people are doing in that environment to federal as well, and understanding the complexities of things like contracting and acquisitions and interoperability and the sometimes the legacy and the archaicness of their infrastructure that causes technology challenges, right? So I think being able to share the lessons learned on both sides is very helpful in terms of how we're looking at solutions, how we're looking at evolving new concepts. So when you think about something like smart cities as an example, where you really need to have both federal and private sector engaged together just because of the amount of synergy. Or you think about something like mobile homes, where they're trying to keep everything into the home now, where whether that's your air conditioning, to your refrigerator, to your toaster, all of that's exciting, but also equally hackable. So if it's equally as hackable, what do I need to know? Do I care? Similar to the example that was on the prior panel with, again, federal health, if you're looking at devices that are now used in hospitals that actually are life or death situations, it might be important for someone to actually understand that from a medical device manufacturing perspective, so that they can know if there are challenges in terms of the device itself, in terms of the interoperability, what they may need to know for hospitals, what they may need to know for other hospitals outside that federal health agency. So as you can see, the complexity now is tenfold and exponential in terms of where people need to focus. And so I think being able to have the people going from one side to the other, as well as the lessons learned going from one side to the other, will be extremely helpful.
So you've shed some light on how complex these issues really are and how much the government really needs to know in order to help protect all of these different pieces. Do you have any advice for the government on how to lean on the private sector a little bit to help secure some of these systems, to make, I mean, with medical, of course, hospitals end up being, responsible, but ultimately the whole country could be at risk. So how can the government lean on the private sector?
And we're starting to see them do this today. We see a lot of federal agencies head out to, as an example, Silicon Valley. You've got new, I would say relatively new types of technologies, and whether those be Bitcoin or blockchain, or as people start to look at different types of items in the supply chain, just as an example, you really start to go, again, outside of just that federal agency. And I think they are leaning in quite a bit just to understand what manufacturers, what companies, what think tanks and joint ventures are looking at, simply because I think they're relying upon these technologies inside of their capabilities and their processes. And so we are seeing a big uptick in, like I said, people going to Silicon Valley and vice versa, people from Silicon Valley coming out to see what our intelligence and national security agencies are doing, our defense sector, because when you look at things, as an example, in defense, yes, they're major missile systems and major satellites, but they're also comprised of many, many different components. And if any one of those components gets compromised along the supply chain, there's an issue for cyber threat potentially. And so we are now seeing those agencies and private sectors working really closely together to understand what are all the pieces, what are the processes in the supply chain, where do they need to consider controls and security parameters so that they can reduce the cyber threat possibilities. And I do agree also with the comment that was made in the panel prior around it's not just the threat and the incident occurring, it's how fast they can recover from that incident. So, we like to say it's secure, vigilant, and resilient. So how quickly you could secure, how vigilant you can be against your threats, and then how resilient you are in coming back from that threat. And it's really important when you look at, again, all the various pieces of those processes, because it could happen at any one of those points.
So going back for a second to what you said about Silicon Valley coming out here, are they coming out here to work? Are they coming out here to learn? I know the government wants to hire more cybersecurity experts, and it's difficult to get them because of salaries or other reasons. What have you seen change recently?
So I think we're seeing, from a federal agency perspective, people looking to be a little bit creative in how they go after the cyber workforce. I mean, we're all trying to go after the cyber workforce. And so when you're trying to basically bid and get the same types of people, whether they be contractor help or whether they be permanent employee help, we're really seeing the federal government kind of try to change some of their thinking. And whether that's something like gain contractors to actually train employees and then actually leverage the training to expand upon it, because some of this is also about retooling. I think, like the gentleman said prior, there's lots of different roles within cyber that need to be undertaken from an organization. And in order to do that, some of the agencies are looking at, can we retool? And if we retool, how do we retool? What do we retool? Do we need to understand state-of-the-art technology? So we are seeing some Silicon Valley come out just to purely start to educate on technology and capabilities. The other thing we're seeing is people, perhaps in agencies, coming up with unique ways to hire. So things like hackathons or developer types of series so that they can actually see and test the types of capabilities that people may have that likely wouldn't show up on a resume, right? It might say someone is a cybersecurity guru, but they might not be able to truly test the capability. And so we're seeing an increase in, like I said, things like hackathons and being able to hire direct from a hackathon, if you will. And then we're also seeing some agencies come up with some creative ways to do the salary and incentive-based hiring, particularly given the competitiveness of cyber. So I do think we're seeing some changes in the hiring practices, and I do think that there's an interest from those in Silicon Valley. Again, I mean, these agencies that sit here in our federal government are defining the policy, and they are defining the interoperability, and they are defining the laws and regulations. And so it behooves not only Silicon Valley, but others in our private sector to also understand that. So we are seeing individuals also make their way into the federal government. And one of the things that some of the federal agencies are looking at doing is a rotation as well, that to help with that kind of demand in terms of cyber talent.
So do you think with training or hiring, that could have a negative impact on contracting dollars? Does that take away from some of the competition? Or I guess it would create more competition.
So you could look at it that either way. Candidly, I think there's so much business to be had that the contracting spend will continue to stay where it is, just given the amount of work, given the amount of demand, given the amount, again, the interoperability is only going to increase. And one of the things I think everybody is realizing is that the adversary technically has more time than we do. And the adversary has more time because they can plan for days, months, weeks, years. And when it hits, we need to be responsive for that. And I think what we're starting to see is more and more agencies and organizations really figure out, how do we become more comprehensive? How do we look at threat from a behavioral analytics perspective, or artificial intelligence, or process robotics, so we can actually start to get ahead? And I think with so much demand, there will not be a decrease on the need for cyber talent, and whether that's employees or contractors, I only see that going on the rise. And I believe there's actually a number of studies who have also showcased just the sheer amount of cyber talent that will be needed today all the way through and beyond 2020.
Has the government talked to you or asked advice at all about how to go about increasing the talent and getting people interested?
Yeah, again, we've had a number of agencies come to us and talk to us and really look at kind of coming up with unique ways. And so we'll hold, whether they be workshops, and really try and understand where their gaps are, because some of the challenges that we're seeing is that agencies don't even recognize perhaps where their gaps even are. So some of this is in the context of, how do we evolve our cyber strategy first, and then how do we look at actually creating a program management office? And then with that, where are the gaps? And again, the gaps could be anywhere from, I need someone to help me with patch and vulnerability management, to I need someone to help me actually think of a risk management framework and how we actually deploy technology to adhere to and meet these needs in a cybersecurity framework, all the way to a disaster happens, what are we supposed to do? And in that last example, that's where, again, I think trying to get creative in terms of how you help agencies. And one of the things we've done is looked at things like cyber wargaming. So we actually mimic scenarios around, if an event happens, if a breach happens, what do you do? And it's not just what do you do from an IT perspective. What does legal do? What does acquisition do? What does PR do? And really, what are you supposed to do in the event of an incident? And then do a war game through that. And then from that, create an after action report. So again, you can identify where those gaps are to help agencies actually remediate and fix them, so that when an actual incident does occur, they'll be better suited and better ready to actually push forward with the remediation and dealing with that incident when it occurs.
So one of the things that you said, you think cybersecurity is going to keep growing, and one of the things that we're waiting on is for the Modernizing Government Technology Act to hopefully be passed. If that isn't passed, if we're still waiting, do you think that there's room to be creative enough to move the money around, or do you think it's going to stall?
I think there's definitely room to be creative, and I think we're going to have to. No one is stopping technology in terms of what our private citizens want. I mean, you just look around, everybody's typically on their phones, or they're on their laptops, or they're trying to figure out what to do. And I know, you've got people looking at, again, artificial intelligence and gaming. And so when you start to think about everything that a private citizen wants, or again, if it's in federal health and you're looking at, I need to have a medical record, that it's one medical record versus 20 medical records. And that applies also in our private world. And so when you start to look at where people want to go with technology, I think even if something does happen with that Modernization Act, agencies, private companies will still need to find some way to continue to move forward, because we are not stopping. And if we're not stopping, then that truly means the adversary is not stopping. And I did mean when I said, when I think they've got much more time than we do to plan attacks, because they could spend all the time in the world to plan the attack. And the more pieces and the more connected devices we give them, the more opportunity there is for cyber.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I want to give you a chance to say anything else that we missed before we wrap up here.
Yeah, no, I just, again, thank you for the time. And I certainly think that, again, with this great landscape and what we've got in this environment, there's certainly opportunity for cyber threats, but there's also opportunities for us to be vigilant in what we do. So thank you again for your time today. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.